like to make the excuse that they prayed for things and they haven't come to pass, so therefore God is not real.
You know, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that you haven't really talked to any atheists. Because if you had, you wouldn't really be making a point like this. What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're having a wonderful Friday, if you're watching this on the upload day. If you're watching it sometime else, then just pretend you're a time traveler. If you're new here, please hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. You'll be able to know when new episodes come out that way. All of that feels fairly obligatory at this point, so let's go ahead and get into fan art and then get into the meat of the video. First we have a Serious Suris is Serious by Flame Baron, a Very, Very H picture by Mr. Balderus, followed by what seems to be a portrait Suris by The Man. As always, thank you all for your fan art submissions, and let's get right into the video itself.
Atheists like to make the excuse that they prayed for things and they haven't come to pass, so therefore God is not real. Which is, you know, crazy, because saying that God is not real is like saying that a creation doesn't have to have a creator.
Alright, so we're already beginning with the blind watchmaker issues. The first issue we're having is that you are using some pretty flimsy definitions. If you look around at everything and call it simply the universe, it doesn't imply a creator. But if you look at everything around you and call it creation, then it would imply a creator. But this is a definitional game. Much like if I look at a piece of art, that implies that it required an artist. But if I call it a picture, it might not require an artist. It could have been photographed. The labels you ascribe to things matter, and they carry weight and baggage. I personally see no reason to call everything around me creation.
But to say that there is no creator when you see a creation is like saying there's no painter for this painting.
Again, definitional games. When you label something a creation, it will imply a creator. I see no need to label it a creation. The reason I might be comfortable looking at a work of art and calling it a painting is because I've seen other examples of paintings juxtaposed to pictures of other varieties. I know what a painting looks like by comparison. The same cannot be said for the universe. You can't look at this universe and then compare it to another one and say that that universe was created and this one wasn't. We have no frame of reference for that. So labeling this universe creation is putting your cart before the horse. It's a bit of an arbitrary label to justify your position.
You know, all these little paintings that I've made, you know, nobody painted that. You know, that's how crazy it is to say that there is no creator. To say that you can have a creation without a creator is absolute lunacy. It's like saying that you can have a painting without a painter.
Did you leave in a couple of takes you didn't plan on having in your video? Because, like, this is the third time you've said this, and I've even cut part of this out. Links for full context will be in the description. As always, those links are not there for you to harass people who I'm responding to. They're there solely to make sure that context is adequately provided for the videos I'm responding to.
And we know that's not possible. You can't have a painting without a painter. You can't have a creation without a creator. So it's really crazy when people want to use this argument. To me, it's really crazy when people want to use this argument and say, hey, you can have a creation, but you don't need to have a creator.
So you've obviously edited this video. And I'm not trying to just nitpick the fact that you left in things that didn't need to be there. I've done that before. But when you're articulating a point, you can easily just say the point and then move on to your next point as long as your major point has been adequately explained. You don't have to keep on saying it over and over again and then have obvious cuts, which let me know that you did edit this video in post and simply decided arbitrarily to keep the same point now 4 times.
Because God didn't answer my prayers about something, that means there's no God.
Oh, we are finally at a separate point. Cool, let's continue.
You know, and that's what you'll often hear from the atheists. We witness to a lot of people. I witness to Muslims every single day. And one of the excuses that we got recently was, hey, my wife's an addict. And, you know, I'm crying myself to sleep and I can't get her to stop using drugs. I've prayed and haven't got an answer, so therefore, there is no God.
Okay, so I made the claim in the beginning of the video that obviously you hadn't talked to any atheists, but you're claiming that you actually have, so let's go ahead and run with that. If someone makes the point that their wife is an addict and they prayed to God to help and God didn't help, and that therefore meant that they didn't need to believe in a God, I would argue that that's a bad point. Not at its foundation, but in its articulation, so I'm again assuming that you are being honest in how you're wording this. What whoever you've been witnessing to seems to be wrestling with is a combination of the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of evil simply being the challenge of reconciling belief in an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God with the existence of evil and suffering in the world. To break it down, if God is omniscient, he knows of the evil. If God is omnipotent, he has the ability to stop the evil. And if he's omnibenevolent, he would want to stop the evil, and yet he does not. This is coupled with the issue of divine hiddenness, is the issue that God seems to be hidden, absent, or silent in everyday life. I'm curious as to how you've responded to this, so let's go on.
And that's just not a logical, explanation. And, and I've had cases where when I was an atheist, and I was just looking into creation science and looking into the Bible, I was praying for somebody who was sick, and they did actually get healed. And it was a testimony to me that, there is a God out there. But that wasn't the whole reason I was basing my belief in God.
Well, I sincerely hope so, because people recover from being sick all the time with or without prayer. And when we've studied the effects of prayer in medicine, we've found that it has no effect in most circumstances. There is one in which the prayer actually has a negative effect. This is when someone who legitimately believes in a god is told that they are being prayed for, and then there's actually a likelihood that they will not get better as easily. While there isn't a definitive explanation as to why, there seems to be a running theory that it has to do with a type of performance anxiety. Given that in this scenario, if someone knows they're being prayed for, and they get better, everything's great. But if they get worse, it means that God has failed them in some way, or otherwise represents a challenge to their previously held beliefs. So I'm glad that that wasn't the only reason that you decided to become a Christian, but you mentioned creation science, and that seems to be a bit of a red flag for me already.
My belief in God wasn't just because he made somebody better. Whether or not he heals somebody is not a reason to believe or to not believe, saying, God, I want this amount of money. If you don't give me this amount of money, then I won't believe. The atheist did a lot of the things that atheists do. We will pray that God will do something, and if he does it, then he's God, and if he doesn't do it, he's not God. For me, a lot of little things I prayed for that did come to pass. I was an athlete at the time when I started considering if there was a God or not. I was an athlete, and I was like, well, if you're real, then help me to win this game. Help me to catch this ball, because I was a goalie and a soccer player. So I would use, a lot of that with when I was doing sports. If you're really there, then help me to do this or help me to do that. And atheists kind of play with God because they want to know, is he really there or not? But it's not really a logical way to go about it, to say, if you're real, then do this or that or the other. If you're real, then do this or that or the other.
One, again, with the multiple takes. If you're going to do multiple takes in your video, then please edit out your takes that you aren't actually going to be using. May I present you with a problem to wrestle with? Consider prayer for just a moment. If we take an omniscient God who knows everything that you're thinking, what is the point of communicating with him at all? What is the point of praying to him that a particular outcome will happen? He already knows what outcome you want, and whether or not he's going to assist with that outcome is based on his whims, not necessarily on how much you wanted to pray for it. Secondly, God has a plan, and if that plan didn't include you winning your game, then wouldn't it then follow that your prayer wouldn't have had any effect on it at all? Elsewise, if it did, then wouldn't that mean that God was suspending his previously laid plan in order to help you? In which case, of what worth is God's plan, if it can be arbitrarily modified at a whim at a mortal's behest? None of these, by the way, are reasons to believe or not believe in a God. These are simply arguments dealing with prayer, and specifically arguments about prayer in regards to a God who is omnipresent and omnipotent. I don't know, I feel if you end up watching this video, these are things you probably should contend with, because they're things that will likely come up when arguing with any type of articulate atheist.
It's not really a logical way to look at God and to treat God. Obviously, if there's a painting, there's a painter, That's like you saying, okay, if you're really a painter, then paint me this picture. but maybe I don't want to paint that picture. I painted this one and that one and that one. Maybe I don't want to paint the one that you want me to paint,
So in the case of a painter, you can ask a painter to paint you a picture, any picture whatsoever, and then they can do it, and that would convince you that they're a painter. There have been enough artists throughout time who have used ghost workers in order to make themselves get famous, only for it to be discovered later that they actually didn't have a hand in their own work. They had been commissioning somebody to do so. In situations like this, there are litmus tests that you can use to determine whether or not someone is actually a painter. If we were to revisit the problem of prayer that I brought up earlier, there is another way to go about this where God is concerned. As opposed to asking God for specific things, since a specific thing would require God either suspending his plan, or his plan already including the thing you wanted in the first place, meaning that your request was arbitrary, and instead consider the angle of understanding that if the God is omniscient, that God knows what would convince you. He knows exactly by what method you would be convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt. And if the God is also omnipotent, then not only do they know how to do this, they have the ability to convince you. And if we lump in that final triomni trait, if the God is also omnibenevolent, then he would have to want you to believe in him, because the alternative is hell. You see, in your example of the painter can provide alternative solutions to allow people to see that they are in fact the painter they claim themselves to be. God really is no different. But if you want to argue that the God simply would not want to convince someone in the way that would be most convincing to them, then you're going to have to get rid of the omnibenevolence. And if you want to argue that he can't because of some arbitrary restriction, New Testament, Old Testament shenanigans, then you're going to have to get rid of the omnipotence. The problem with a triomni God is that to have all three omni traits, there have to be contradictions. At least were that God to exist in the current world we find ourselves right now. This is a problem that can be reconciled by giving up a few of the omni traits, but then you're stripping powers away from your God.
It's like saying, if you're really a painter, then paint this picture. We know that there's a God because there's a creation all around us, and that speaks volumes that there is a God, and you can't say that there isn't a God when you have such a...
As I said earlier in the video, this is a language game at this point. You have a universe around you. There is no need to arbitrarily call it a creation, therefore putting your cart before your horse.
Mighty creation out there. If you just, look at the creation around you, you can see that there's a God.
This is what's called the argument from creation, or as it is so lovingly said by most people in the atheist community, the look at the trees argument. However, here's a fun little scenario I can pose to you that throws a monkey wrench in the whole problem. You can look around at the beauty and majesty of the world and say that it must have been created, but that does not imply that there is a God. And even if it did imply there was a God, it does not necessitate that it is the Christian God. You mentioned that you talk to Muslims as well, so I'm imagining there's something exceptional about the Christian God that you're trying to proselytize to them. But if we are willing to accept that a God, definitionally, is any being that has the ability to create, or elsewise have a measure of divinity and deification, there's nothing in that definition that I provided that implies that this thing would not be seen as a God to humans. There's also nothing in that definition that necessitates it A, being the Christian God, and B, being immortal. You see, there are these people called deists, who believe that the universe was in fact created by a God, but that God has since abandoned the universe and neither knows nor cares of the struggles within it. You can even go one step further than that and argue that a God created the universe, but that creation expended all of the energy that God had, and it died. What's left is a mortal universe, and it's exactly as we see it today. The clockwork nature of the universe necessitated by the fact that that God would not have the ability to work in that universe anymore after it was created. And suddenly, we have a universe that has been created by a God, and that God no longer existing. Both the Muslim variety of God, the deistic variety of God, and the mortal variety of God all support various theist and even one atheist position, and all of them are granting your premise that everything around you is creation, and none of them point to the Christian God. This is the problem with the argument from creation, or the argument from beauty, or any of the arguments that require the world around you as evidence of God. A, none of them point to yours, and B, none of them even necessitate that God being around anymore.
And it's just plain ignorance to say that there is no God. That's just ignorance.
If it is ignorant to say there is no God, it is equally ignorant to say that there is a God. Your ability and my ability to perceive reality is limited by the natural. God, definitionally, is a supernatural being. He exists outside our ability to perceive. If you are to make the argument that based on my ability to perceive, it is ignorant for me to say there is no God, it's equally ignorant for you to make the exact same claim, but in reverse. This is because we're operating with the exact same tools, and their scope is exactly limited in the same way. If you want a statement like that, you have to be willing to bite that bullet.
But atheists use a number of excuses. One of the excuses that they like to use is because there's pain and suffering in my life. One of the arguments that atheists like to use is, hey, there's more pain and suffering in my life than I think should be here.
Again, another double edit. I know that you don't do YouTube as, like, a job or anything, and I'm not trying to make fun of you here. Throughout all of this, I'm actually just trying to give you argumentation so that you can either strengthen your position or abandon it if you find it sufficiently weak. Here, though, I'm really starting to get grated by the fact that your video contains both your takes and your outtakes. If you want to deliver a message, which if you're proselytizing, then definitionally, yeah, you want to deliver a message to people, please prune and sculpt that message so that it's actually digestible by most people. But continue, you were talking about suffering.
So, therefore, there's no God. But sometimes, God's using the pain and suffering to bring us closer to Him.
Alright, so let me go ahead and give you an example that I actually used back when I was a Christian. Now, I've mentioned this example on my channel before, but if you're a newer subscriber, this might seem a little dicey, but trust me, this is how I was back when I was a kid. I was a creationist, a pretty hardcore Christian. I had the entire Left Behind series, took classes on the Bible over and above what I did at church, and I'd come from a private young earth creationist Christian school. A friend of mine who was very near and dear to my heart was sexually violated. I had not been properly introduced to that sordid and terrible part of the world yet. I was still very much living in my Christian bubble where God would protect me from harm. I couldn't conceive of a world in which my friend actually deserved the thing happening to them. And please note, whenever I mentioned this next point, this was young, bigoted Christian me. These are no longer the things that I adhere to. But I flat out told my friend that you were raped because it was part of God's plan. God's plan included that happening to you so that if you came in contact with another rape victim, you would be able to empathize with them and you would be able to help them appropriately. Let's take my argument and your argument together and show exactly what's wrong with both of these. In your argument, that rape would be used to somehow get my friend closer to God. Now, can you personally, and I recognize this is a bit of an argument from incredulity, but fallacious or not, I don't think this is an inappropriate way to word this. Can you personally conceive of any person in the world who, to get them closer to you, you would have them violently sexually assaulted? Please consider this for a moment. Pause the video if you need to. You can even write in the comment description if you desperately need to flesh out your thoughts on this. But please, just think. Is there anyone in the world who you would have violently assaulted sexually in order to bring them closer to you? And I would hope you come to the conclusion, especially since I hear kids in the background and I'm assuming they're yours, that you would never want someone to be violently sexually assaulted just to get them closer to you. You would rather them be safe because you love them. Like I said before, you're gonna have to give up one of those 3 omni traits. God cannot be all good and want this situation to happen. He cannot be omniscient and not be able to perceive of another way to get someone closer to him. And he can't be all-powerful and not be able to convince them any other way. And now let's take that same example and deconstruct it based on what my perception was as a kid. My argument necessitated that God's plan involved several hundreds of thousand people being sexually assaulted, and that a few more people past the people he had planned on being assaulted needed to be assaulted so that they could empathize with the people who were being hurt. This creates a never-ending cycle of perpetual victims and people who need to be victims in order to properly help previously victimized people. In this situation, either the god is too uncreative to perceive of a world in which rape is not included, or he is not powerful enough to stop it, or he simply doesn't care. Most atheists, instead instead of trying to strip one or many of these omni traits away and depower the god they believe in, simply just stop believing in that god. Some may also become pagans with gods that aren't as unnecessarily cruel. This was one of the things that slowly stripped my perception of God away. I know for many atheists, scenarios like this and argumentation like yours will push them further away from God as well. Any deity who is both triomni and also necessitates suffering to get you closer to them is either lying about their triomni traits or elsewise an abuser. And even if they aren't lying about their triomni traits, any being that claims to love you and also claims that you need to be sexually violated in order to become closer to me is abusive.
So that's why we're suffering. That's why he's allowing this pain to bring you closer to him, to humble you, to change you.
Again, think of somebody who desperately needs to violently assault you in order to humble you so that you can properly prostrate yourself in front of them. You would call this person abusive, mad with power, a megalomaniac, a narcissist, any number of things. But then in a situation like this, you get to special plead and argue that it's different because it's your god. The god you're painting is a monster.
But the atheists don't look at it like that. They're like, if things aren't going my way, the way that I want them to go, then there is no God.
This is going to be a very dark episode, and I'm about to get into another incredibly dark example, and I apologize for that. But this is like a child saying my parent doesn't love me, and then when someone asks them, well, why don't you think your parent loves you, and they bring up the fact that they are beaten by their parents. That child has pretty good evidence that they don't actually have loving parents, and then you just say, oh, just because things aren't going your way, your parents don't love you? That's effectively what you're doing here, and it's really messed up.
And that's the weird part about atheists. But I was an atheist, but I'm obviously part Native American. Well, obviously I was an atheist, but I'm part Native American.
Double edit again?
If you can't tell. And Native Americans are very clairvoyant and very, they rely on dreams and visions and stuff like that a lot. So I was always taught that. My grandma was a Cherokee, but she was actually a Christian. And she would tell me, there's angels watching over you, all sorts of stuff like that. She was very clairvoyant. That's the way that Native Americans are. So they look for signs and stuff like that. And that's one of the things that led me to a belief in Christ was dreams. I had a dream about hell. After Christians had preached the gospel to me and told me how to be saved, I had a dream about hell, and I woke up and trusted in Christ.
So wait, recovery of sick people was not a good reason to be a Christian, but the reason that you've chosen, which I would hope you consider as a good reason since it's the reason that you're using, is that you had a dream that you would be in hell. Let's ignore for a moment the, again, moral monster argument that I've been creating before, where the god has created hell at all, and that makes him a morally repugnant piece of garbo. Let's ignore that argument, and instead focus on the power of dreams. If I am to accept that a dream was a good reason for you to become a Christian, then you would have to accept that a polytheist who had a dream involving Odin has good reason to become a heathen. You would have to argue that a Muslim being told they would have to eat zakum fruit for the rest of their life in a dream is an adequate reason for them to become a Muslim. Likewise, you would have to agree that if I, as an atheist, have a dream that there is no God, this is a good enough reason for me to not believe in God. If you are to accept, as a monotheist, that your God's method involving dreams is good and useful, you have to abandon the monotheist position and accept that other variants of gods will use the exact same methods of communication.
But it was, multiple dreams and visions and stuff like that brought me to the point that helped. They played a role in it. I wasn't relying only on dreams and visions, but dreams and visions played a role in my conversion, because Native Americans just are always taught that dreams and visions mean things, and then being an artist.
So you realize that what you're engaging in is a bit of an argument from antiquity. Because Native Americans have believed and taught this tradition of dreams being important for clairvoyance sake, therefore it is still a useful tool now. Unfortunately for both of us, the mere fact that it's been used as a tool in the past does not mean that it's a valid tool for use now, or even that it was ever a valid tool to use to begin with. But apparently your next issue is art, so let's get into that.
Now, artists can, get messages from all sorts of different things around them. People that have artistic minds, that have photographic memory or videographic memory. Artists have videographic or photographic memory. So,
no. Artists don't necessarily have videographic or photographic memory. In fact, most artists have to actually use reference material all the time when creating their art, because they do not have eidetic memory.
For artists, basically all sorts of things can speak to them. They'll notice things all around them and they're speaking to them and saying something to them. So me as an artist would run into a lot of things that were speaking to me about God, and just like, how can this be a coincidence? One time I had a dream that I got into a car accident at a certain road, and I got to that road the next day and almost got in a car accident and died right at that road. So I was like, whoa, something's happening here, because my dreams are actually happening in reality. So something's happening here.
And what you're engaging in now is called confirmation bias, or even worse, the sharpshooter fallacy. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. The sharpshooter fallacy is what happens when you take that new evidence and ignore all the other evidence against it and focus solely on that evidence. If you had a dream about you crashing and then happened to come to an intersection where you almost crashed, you're ignoring the other hundreds of dreams you've had where it's had no bearing on reality whatsoever. Because your bias was confirmed the one time, you then engaged in sharpshooter. This does not mean that you were wrong in believing this. It could very well be that there was something more to that, and we simply haven't been able to explain or figure that out. What I'm criticizing is the method by which you came to that belief, or that conclusion.
And, Native Americans, artists, people like that, have a lot of that sort of stuff going on. Weird stuff that they just can't explain. So that was part of it. The other part of it was the creation science evangelism. When I started looking into the creation science evangelism material and seeing the evidence for creation, the evidence for the Bible, the evidence for Noah's flood. All these fossils are evidence for Noah's flood. Native Americans, as you know, like to collect arrowheads and fossils. So I collected a lot of arrowheads and fossils, and that got me really interested in what creation science evangelism had to say about fossils. And if you look at what they have to say, it makes them, a million times more sense than evolution.
Okay, so for those who don't know, creation science evangelism is Kent Hovind's shtick. You can find all of the information he wants people to suck down about that over at drdino.com. Miss, I'm sorry to tell you, but Kent Hovind has been debunked 1,000 times. He's been debunked by scientists, he's been debunked by people of various religions who aren't even atheists, he's been debunked by other Christians. If you're going to argue that his material is what convinced you to be a Christian, then that paints this whole situation in a new light. You literally believe bullshit evidence without doing any further research. Moreover, you do realize that evolution can exist in a world where God created it, because evolution says nothing about the origins of life. Evolution is just about the diversification. In fact, if you were to take the nonsensical story of Noah's Ark and apply the theory of evolution to it afterwards, it makes more sense now, not less sense. This is because without evolution, species would not be able to diversify, and diversification of species is one of the reasons why a story like Noah's Ark would be more palatable. If he doesn't have to carry as many species into the Ark because they have the ability to diversify, the story is now more palatable to people who otherwise wouldn't believe it. People have done the actual mathematical measurements on the Ark and found that the Ark could not possibly have held the amount of animals the Bible says that it would be able to hold. This doesn't suddenly mean that Noah's Ark happened. It didn't. There are tons of other breakdowns and dissertations about Noah's Ark that show why that entire story is bogus, and I'm not personally going to get into those right now. Fact of the matter is, if your reason for believing Christianity is something Kent Hovind, then that doesn't frame anything you say for the rest of this video in a positive light, and there's only a minute left.
Evolution doesn't make any sense. You look at evolution, they're telling us over millions of years things died and became fossils, where the creation side of it is that millions of things were buried in water under the earth in all these layers because of Noah's flood. All these things got buried. Millions of animals all over the earth, millions of dead things were buried in water and mud all over the earth. That's how they fossilized.
You do know that evolution says nothing about fossilization, right? Fossilization is a thing that happens regardless of whether or not the theory of evolution holds true. This is like when people say that evolution has something to do with the origin of life. It doesn't. Evolution has nothing to do with that, nor does it have anything to do with fossilization.
The creation view is completely different than the evolution view, which tells us that everything just died over millions of years and became fossils.
You are aware that a mosquito right now could find itself trapped in amber and become a fossil in our time period, right? And that if that happened over several millions of years to multiple animals, because it can happen right now to a literal bug on a tree, then it de facto already makes sense. It's a thing you can witness happening right now, and there's nothing to say that it didn't happen in the past multiple times. There's nothing about fossilization that has ever necessitated a flood.
Fossils are made under special circumstances. Things have to be buried in mud, and it has to be heated, and it has to go a certain way for a fossil to be made.
No, the 3 conditions necessary to form a fossil is that the organism must have hard parts such as a shell, bone, teeth, or wood tissue. The remains must escape destruction after death. This doesn't have to be by mud. There are other methods that fossilization can happen here. And then the remains must be buried rapidly in order to prevent decomposition. But again, rapidly does not mean within a matter of seconds because a giant flood happened. It can be via many things, such as a landslide or, again, cascading amber down a tree.
Just look at what you have to do to make a fossil today, and you can tell. So just because somebody's going through suffering and God isn't ending that suffering doesn't mean that he's not real. It just means he's leaving that suffering for a reason. It's drawing you closer to him. It's making you rely on him, making you dependent on him.
Note, making a person suffer in order to foster codependence from that person is abuse. If this were being done by a family member or a spouse, they would be engaging in some of the most capricious abuse and control that a human being can engage in. But because it's your God, you get to make the special pleading case that this isn't abusive for some reason.
But that was one atheist excuse today, was that, there's too much suffering in his life, and he believes that there can't be a God because of all the suffering that he's going through. Tell that to the disciples that were martyred,
Oh, so you're a fucking bootstrapper. The mere fact that somebody else had it worse at some point in time suddenly invalidates everything that a person is feeling right now? Would you then also tell somebody who's being beat by their abusive husband who's trying to foster codependency that you tripped and fell down some stairs one time, so it's okay that they got beat? No, you wouldn't, because a splinter in my toe doesn't solve the fact that you stubbed yours. All you're doing is try to give the disciples the bigger dick card.
Christians go through all sorts of suffering. I've been through all sorts of crazy suffering in my life. So, suffering is not in and of itself an excuse to not believe in God.
You're right. Sitting through your video was not an excuse for me to not believe in God. I have other reasons besides the suffering that your channel put me through. But at the end of the day, I think I've figured out the problem. It's not that you haven't talked to enough atheists. It's that you're getting your methodology from Kent fucking Hovind. It's okay that the boy drowned at my complex, Kent Hovind. He drowned in the water, but the rest of his family had a good time, and they're probably going to come back, and even though one of their kids drowned here. It's great. That guy. Kent Hovind, the great and powerful person who also had to make an entire video being an absolute dickwaffle to GM Skeptic simply because GM Skeptic, who used to idolize Kent Hovind, no longer believes in the same god that Kent does. Miss, I'm sure you mean well, and I'm sure that your intent is not to play apologist for a perpetual abuser who engages in one-sided relationships in order to foster codependency. But the case you've made in this video is just that. If you've seen my video, I'd like to hear your thoughts, and if you're one of my viewers watching this video, don't immediately go over to her channel and harass her. That's not the purpose of the link in the description. Keep discussions to my comment section if you can. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button, and if you didn't, then let me know in the comment section below and tell me exactly how many ways you wish I got killed in prison, I guess. No, Wednesdays are going to be comment response days for a little while, so I'll be seeing a lot of that. Subscribe and hit the bell icon if you haven't already. Patreon's always a wonderful method of support if you've got the ability to. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.